Um, I'm just going to jump right in, basically to describe what we did and then some of the challenges that we experienced along the way, which is always important for the learning process. So this is a set of interventions that 3IE funded to support latrine use in rural India. We focused on ensuring research transparency best practices were followed throughout the life course of this program. And so what happened was in this program, we funded 4 separate impact evaluations for interventions to support latrine use. We then conducted a meta-analysis to determine the average effects of these interventions on self-reported latrine use and a latrine observation index. This was made possible because the 4 evaluations used a single set of metrics. But like I said, we had some hiccups along the way, and I'm going to share some insights from that evidence synthesis process today. So briefly, an introduction to 3IE. The International Initiative for Impact Evaluation is a membership-based not-for-profit with 3 primary goals. We strongly advocate for the generation and use of evidence. We believe in fostering conversations that build a culture of evaluation. In doing this, we support innovation in the fields of evidence synthesis and impact evaluation and provide standards regarding the quality of these works. We also produce knowledge and public goods. We host an evidence repository that includes a comprehensive database of impact evaluations and systematic reviews. We also publish academic works, reports, and briefs for the studies that we support and carry out. So before diving in, I want to frame a bit about this evidence program. In 2016, the Indian government began a major push to support latrine use in rural India. I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but India is the country with the largest rate of open defecation in the world. So there's really a lack of access to basic sanitation, or there was at the time. And 3IE partnered with the Research Institute for Compassionate Economics to support the Promoting Latrine Use in Rural India Evidence Program with support from the Gates Foundation. The aim of this program was to generate evidence on the effectiveness of low-cost behavioral science-informed interventions to improve latrine use. We also wanted to explore how latrine use could be rigorously measured. So in the first phase of this program, we conducted a scoping study to determine why people with latrines were not using them. We had 8 teams carry out pilots of behavioral interventions in 7 states. Latrine use, coverage to use, and barriers varied across states. Therefore, the actual activities that each of the teams implemented were slightly different and based off of the local context. We then selected 4 teams to carry out impact evaluations of 4 different interventions in 4 different states. All teams used cluster randomization and collected data in intervention and control sites before and after the interventions, and this was to allow for a difference in difference approach. At the same time, we supported an independent measurement team that worked with subsamples in each of the 4 project areas to test the validity of latrine use measures using different tools. So we always ask that our grantees follow standards for research transparency, which is the purpose of this whole discussion. So before implementing these programs, all teams have to develop a pre-analysis plan, and they have to register their studies on RIDE, which is a pre-analysis plan that we support. So the pre-analysis plan for this meta-analysis was also finalized a priori. After the completion of all 3IE funded studies, teams make their data and statistical code publicly available on the Harvard Dataverse repository. So these have already been posted for the individual studies, and we are in the process of finalizing the push button replication for this meta-analysis. I heard at the end of the last conversation, people talking about how do we incentivize research transparency. So what we do is we mandate that our grantees follow these practices, which maybe it's a little bit of a strong arm approach, but it gets it done and things get posted. And so the unique aspect of this program was that we asked the 4 teams to agree upon a standard set of measures before the implementation of these interventions. The development of this common set of indicators was an extensive collaborative process among the 4 teams, 3IE and RICE. This process included members from Indian research institutions and international sanitation and behavioral science experts. Ultimately, they developed a carefully worded question regarding the latrine use practices of each household member and an set of indicators for the observed state of the latrine. So these indicators included things like whether or not the latrine was clogged with dirt or leaves, and were summed to create a latrine observation index that reflected the number of characteristic signs of latrine use that were present at a household. Teams also collected data on the type of latrine used as well as demographic information. The collaborative process of developing standardized measures resulted in a unique opportunity for evidence synthesis. We have a data set that includes the same set of indicators for several different interventions in several different contexts. This allows us to conduct comparative analysis and estimate mean effects. We can make generalizable conclusions about the impacts of these types of interventions. So it's really this common set of indicators that makes this grant window unique. I do want to take a minute to highlight some of the differences between the 4 studies. So these studies had different inclusion criteria and activities. They all focused on households with latrines, but the standards for the quality of those latrines varied. Interventions were also implemented by different teams. So we can't really know if differences in results are because of differences in the activities, the teams, or the target population. And that's just a limitation of this approach. But the most important thing that we have to highlight here is that there were slightly different research designs. And this is where we ran into a little bit of trouble. So 3 of the 4 studies interviewed the same participants at baseline and endline, but the 4th study in Gujarat, they had 2 separate sets of participants. So they had repeated cross sections. And this has important methodological implications for us. What we wanted to do was conduct a difference in difference analysis to determine the effects of the 4 interventions on self-reported latrine use and the latrine observation index, and then compare these results across the difference contexts. For the 3 studies that interviewed the same participants at baseline and endline, we could have used a fixed effects model. But for that 4th study, it was not possible because we don't actually have repeated measures. The repeated cross-sectional data in that study required the use of a difference in difference with control variables to try to account for those inherent fixed effects. We therefore considered 2 options. We could either use fixed effects estimation where possible and control variables where necessary, or apply the same analytical approach with control variables to all 4 studies. Although the fixed effects estimation approach could be stronger, we wanted to be able to do that direct comparison of results. And because of that, we decided to take the latter approach and use control variables without fixed effects for the analysis in all 4 studies. So ultimately, we adopted a difference in difference design that used clustered standard errors and included control variables to estimate changes in self-reported latrine use and the latrine observation index. The equation here shows how linear regressions are developed for a difference in difference. So A is the latrine use in control individuals at baseline. Beta 1 reflects their change in latrine use between baseline and endline. Beta 2 is the difference at baseline between intervention and control sites. And then beta 3 is that difference in difference term. So it reflects the additional change between baseline and endline and treatment individuals relative to the control. So we also had to conduct some sensitivity analyses because of those differences in the study designs in Gujarat. So one approach that we took was we used the baseline data from Gujarat to impute the expected baseline latrine use of those measured at endline. And we did this in R using the MICE package. The variables that we used to allow for that imputation were age, sex, caste, religion, household size, village, and then the number of pits in the latrine. And so once we had the expected baseline latrine use of those measured at endline, we could conduct the DID on that imputed data set. So for the meta-analysis, what we did was we pooled the 4 data sets and ran the DID on the pooled data set. Here we included a fixed effect for state. This resulted in an estimation of the average treatment effect from the 4 interventions. We also conducted sensitivity analyses in which we dropped Gujarat from the analysis and in which we used the imputed baseline data for Gujarat. So finally, onto the results. What did we actually find out about self-reported latrine use? First, I'm showing the 3 studies that used comparable sampling approaches and the meta-analysis effect estimated across those 3 studies. So what we see that there's some variation, but on average, these interventions were effective in increasing self-reported latrine use. Here, I'm adding in the estimated effect for Gujarat using the raw data and the summary effect estimated across the 4 studies. What you can see is that the results are essentially the same, which is good. We're not changing it too much. And finally, here I'm using the imputed values, so where we imputed the expected baseline latrine use of those in Gujarat measured at endline. The imputation did result in the expansion of the confidence intervals and a slight shift towards the null. But again, the story is remaining essentially the same. We're having a consistent, moderate increase in self-reported latrine use through these 4 interventions. I'm not going to go walk through the exact same thing for the latrine observation index, but we took the same approach. We have null effects, but we find that all of the sensitivity analyses do result again in the same story, which is always reassuring and confirms that this approach at least is pointing us in one consistent direction. So some other interesting findings that we had were that in all states, women used the latrine more than men, and scheduled castes were the group with the highest latrine use. Interestingly, the relationship between age and latrine use varied across states. Oh, sorry. So this comparison of the relationship between the various demographic factors and latrine use across states is only possible because the same metrics and the same analytical approach were adopted. As part of this grant, each of the 4 teams wrote a final report, which included some similar analyses to these. They all had their own impact evaluations, but they all used different approaches, different control variables, slightly different model specifications. And because of that, we couldn't actually make these comparative conclusions based off of the 4 reports. So the key here was this adoption of consistent measurement and the same analytical approach. And this is why we were hesitant to use fixed effects for some and control variables for others. So now on to some lessons learned through the process. So we came into this process with the goal of conducting this type of prospective individual participant meta-analysis. To make this possible, we ensured that common metrics were used, but we sort of made the oversight of not ensuring common sampling approaches. So lesson learned for next time. In addition, we experienced some challenges working with the 4 teams to make sure that the data was harmonized. So some of the variables that we are interested in had to be dropped because they were not gathered in a consistent way across studies. As an example, education was gathered with sort of different bins in the different studies, and then it's not possible to use that as a predictor in these models because they're not actually comparable variables. Also, getting the code books and the data into a shape that people outside of the individual research teams could use these and make sense of them was challenging and took a bit of time. We had to recode a lot of variables to be consistent across the 4 studies. So some studies had yes and no coded as 0, 1, or 1, 0, or 1 and 2, and the same thing with like male and female. And these other sort of relatively minor differences tend to add up and can introduce problems. And then you have to go back to the research teams, and it just becomes a process. So next time, if we were going to come back at this and do it again, we would ask for more detailed README files and information about the variable construction, about the variable labels, and the codes for missing data, among other sort of basic data transparency, sort of knowing what the data says issues. And we would also ask for a standard set of metrics about demographic information and making sure that that was measured comparably as well. So just the take-home message here, what did we learn? This a priori co-design of 4 studies to allow for evidence synthesis created a great research opportunity. It's a way forwards in order to allow for a more intensive use of data, because instead of just looking at individual studies, you'll be able to make these comparative deductions and understand what's going on in general, make these sort of broader conclusions that yes, in general, these interventions did work. But we have to be careful that everything is harmonized appropriately and that you don't just focus on harmonizing one part and miss out something else. We were careful to follow standards for research transparency, encouraging open data and conducting a lot of sensitivity analyses. So that's a strength of this. But again, sort of making sure that you know exactly the approach that's taken way back when these started, like 4 or 5 years ago, as things were getting planned, having that all of that thought out from the outset would be helpful next time around. So with that, I want to thank all the participants and the researchers for their help on this project. It was an incredible undertaking by all of the research teams. So I want to thank the PIs from the 4 studies, Shruti Viswanatha, Hans Molsler, Bethany Caruso, and Val Curtis. Val recently passed away and I had a lifetime of contributing to WASH. I'm going to return to my conclusion slide and open things up for questions. Oops, not that way.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so if people want to add questions or comments to the chat, you can do that. Or if you would just rather speak up, then you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. So let us know. And if not, I have a couple questions, but I want to give room to other people first. Okay, well, I can ask mine. So I was thinking about 3IE and how much these teams probably benefited from, having an existing like organizational structure that helped them, figure out how to what standardized methods or variables to use and that kind of thing. And for anyone who isn't necessarily part of an organization like 3IE, maybe they're working more independently or they're just working in a smaller institution. I was curious if you have any suggestions for how someone like that might try to approach a project like this.
Yeah, so I mean, we were able to have these great workshops where everyone comes together and talks to each other about what is the appropriate measurement tool here, and really spend a lot of time piloting those and do the measurement study independently. But obviously not everyone has that resource available to them. I think that being able to talk with a lot of other people in the field, so for WASH, for water and sanitation, there is a huge discussion on measurement and how measurement is being done. There's a lot of tools out there about validating different approaches. For us, there was a lot of discussion of like self-report versus observation. And I think that even just having discussions with your colleagues, with people who are already in that field, at least then when someone comes back to you and challenges you, why did you do it this way? You are able to say, yes, we actually thought about it. We had these discussions and this is the reason.